I'm making a game where you control a colony of ant people. Previously, I've made the ants gather resources and fight off predators, and in the last video, a lot of people suggested using pheromone trails to help control your ants. I thought this was a really cool idea. It would definitely make the little guys feel a lot more ant-like. And so I spent some time researching how real ants use pheromones to find food. It's actually surprisingly simple. The ants start by just wandering around randomly, and they leave a pheromone as they go that naturally ends up being more concentrated the closer they are to the nest. This allows them to find their way back to the nest just by following the pheromone in reverse. And then this means that when they find food, they can return to the nest, and as they go they leave behind a different pheromone that provides the trail, and the other ants will reinforce this trail as they follow it. This was fun to learn about, but the thing is, I'm making a video game rather than a simulation, and that means that instead of trying to replicate things exactly how they are in the real world, I'm instead trying to create some interesting gameplay that poses fun decisions and challenges for the player. So instead of simulating how real ants do pheromones, I instead thought, how can I simplify this way down to create the gist of pheromones, but in a way that's more simple and fun to control? So here was my concept. Every ant in your colony now belongs to a building, and you'll have a bunch of buildings and therefore a bunch of ants. And each building can lay down its own pheromone trail using simple click and drag controls. And then the ants from that building will patrol up and down their trail looking for things to interact with. What's nice about this approach is that it gives you quite a detailed level of control over the ants, since you can have many different buildings and you can give each of them a different trail, but at the same time, it doesn't go too far in the micromanaging direction. You control groups of ants at a time rather than giving instructions to a single ant. So let's take a look at how I made this. I started with a very simple trail following algorithm. Basically, it lays down a set of fixed distance waypoints. Every time the cursor moves far enough from the last waypoint, a new waypoint will be laid down, and this results in a path that follows your cursor. I also made it impossible to cross the trail over itself. Instead, it'll just shorten back to that point whenever you cross it. However, the big problem with this is that it can make some very jagged paths, and so the next step was to add a level of smoothing to the trail. The last handful of waypoints in your trail will be pulled towards the cursor as you move it, and this creates a smoothing effect. So we have a trail now, but the next step is to render it. I started by converting this trail into a spline, and then converting the spline into a regular mesh. If you're not familiar with splines, they're basically the same thing as the pen tool in Photoshop. You set a series of waypoints, and each waypoint can have a curve applied to it, and so you can define a curved line that passes through all of these waypoints. Splines are not very well supported in Unity, so I use this free package by Sebastian Legge, who makes the Coding Adventure series on YouTube. With some minor modifications to his code, I got this spline mesh created. And this is also how I create the smooth outlines that go around the buildings and the plants in this game, in case you were wondering about that. If we go into wireframe view, you can see how this mesh was set up. It's just a simple zigzagging path of triangles, and this is a fairly simple kind of mesh to program. Anyway, this trail looks like crap, so I made a special shader to render the mesh as a wispy trail of smell. I made this shader in Shader Graph, mainly so that I can show it in this video and more easily explain how it works. Basically, we're going to take the average of two scrolling Perlin noise generators to get this ripple effect. This is how ripple effects are commonly made in all sorts of games, often for water shaders. I then add these ripples to a radial gradient texture, and then I take a threshold of the result. Everything below the threshold becomes transparent, and everything above the threshold becomes white. And this creates this cool wobbling blob effect. The spline mesh has some special UV coordinates that allow me to stretch this blob over the whole trail. And the reason why we use white is because it can be tinted later to any colour that we want. Then to add some extra waviness, I added another scrolling purlin noise, this time one-dimensional, and also this time I'm shifting the mesh's vertices instead of distorting the pixels. I did this by setting up the mesh's normal vectors to be perpendicular to the spline path, and I can then access these normal vectors to displace the trail and make it wiggle from side to side. And when you put all of this together, you get this effect. I also added some sound effects, and I spawned some particles along the path whenever it's shortened. And also, when you deselect the building, the path will fade away. As a final touch, I added a vignette, so that the trails can be partially revealed when they're near your mouse. This allows you to see which trails are in a particular area, without them filling up the whole screen and looking messy. So that's the trails done, and now I just had to make the ants patrol up and down their trail. And whenever they see something interesting, they'll interact with it. And different kinds of ants can interact with different things. The concept is to make you lay down all these pheromone trails so that your different gathering buildings will efficiently cover the map and collect all of the relevant resources. But it's not just gathering that these are useful for, in fact they're especially useful for combat, because they'll let you have control over the positioning of your fighting forces. And so I decided it was time to add a second ant type, archer ants. Now, I know that real ants don't do archery, but that's okay because these guys are ant people, and people do archery. I had a little trouble with the designs because the art style I'm using doesn't have outlines, and the ants are very small. So I needed to pick colours that would contrast well with everything around them, and so I tried out a bunch of different schemes. I also thought that a little Robin Hood archery cap would help you tell these ants apart at a quick glance. In the end, I went with a black bow. In the future I might make all held items black like this, and then give the ants different coloured hats to tell them apart better. Time will tell. Now, since these ants are using a bow, I'm going to have to improve my animation system. I'm making this game in Unity's Data-Oriented Tech Stack, or DOTS, which lets you run your code very fast, but unfortunately animation is not well supported in DOTS, and so basically I'm going to have to program this myself. I decided the simplest way to do it would be to break down your characters into quads and then animate each quad separately. A big advantage of doing it this way is I can make the GPU handle the animation. Basically, I made this shader, which looks very complicated, but really all it's doing is transforming a quad in various ways. So I can scale it, rotate it, shift it, and set a pivot point as well. I can do all of this just by changing the shader properties. This shader is going to operate using a sprite sheet of all of my various ant images. And now all I have to do is set up two quads inside of Unity and give each of them a different cell on this sheet. And then I can transform the quads to make it look like the ant is holding the bow, and the bow can also be rotated to make the ant aim. And again, all of that is being done by modifying the material properties of each quad. To start with, I just made the ants aim at my mouse. I decided to stop them from aiming exactly downwards. They can still aim downwards, but their bow doesn't point exactly downwards, and that's because then the bow would clip into the ground. It's not ideal, but I think this still looks good enough. And I also think that probably the grass is going to have to become a little bit lighter. But overall, this is looking good. Then I made the ants aggro to my mouse and shoot arrows at it. As you can see, they are missing all of their shots. And that's because these ants don't understand ballistics yet. I did a little research and I found these simultaneous equations that define the trajectory of a projectile in terms of speed and the angle of launch. And then I looked into how to solve these equations, and I quickly realized this is going to get very complicated, especially if I want the ants to be able to hit moving targets, which I definitely do. So I abandoned that plan, and I came up with a much simpler solution that's also a little bit hackier. Basically, we start by calculating a straight line trajectory. Then we add gravity to that trajectory, and then we figure out how much that's thrown the path off course and we adjust for that. Simple. Now we just need some sound effects and a bit of polish. The arrows in this shot are very slowly shrinking and disappearing to stop the game from filling up with a million arrows, which would eventually make it all lag. So I want to add these archer ants into the main game, but first they're gonna need a building, and so I started drawing a new archery range design. I wanted to make a nice, clean, snappy time-lapse video of me drawing this, but in the end I ended up drawing and redrawing the design because I wasn't quite happy with it. I ended up with nearly an hour of footage. But I'm going to leave most of this footage in anyway, since it shows what drawing is really like, at least for me. I'm often going back and forth, rubbing things out, not being happy with what I've drawn, trying again. At least I find that I can very rarely draw things great first time. And it's still possible that I'm going to come back in the future and tweak this design a little bit more, or even perhaps redo it. One thing I did know that I wanted is to put some green into this design, because the castle that I made last week ended up being just a bit brown. It is made out of dirt after all, but I wanted to make sure that the game wasn't all just different shades of brown in your ant colony. I want to have some green and some other colours in there. A lot of people have asked me what program I'm using to draw, and it is Adobe Animate. That used to be known as Adobe Flash. I'm sure if you're a little bit older, you'll remember playing Flash games on the internet. They used to be quite common until a few years ago when Adobe retired the Flash player because it had all sorts of security problems in it. And since then, games have moved on to HTML5. But Flash does still exist, it's just called Animate now. And I prefer this program to Adobe Illustrator, which most people use, because I just find it much easier to quickly sketch out and draw vector graphics in Animate than I can in Illustrator. Illustrator is just a bit too complex and heavyweight for my purposes. I'm also using a Wacom Cintiq tablet. These are the ones that have a built-in screen. It allows you to have hand-eye coordination as you're drawing into your computer. I used to have a tablet that didn't have a built-in screen, and I found that this was terrible. It spent so much time erasing lines because I just couldn't quite get that coordination right. Anyway, eventually I got this archery range loaded into the game. And now I just needed to put it all together. The worker ants were working, the archery ants were archerying, they could each be controlled using separate pheromone trails, and everything was well in the forest today. So that's all I got done in these past 2 weeks. Now let's think about what's coming next. I want to link the archery ants and the worker ants together. So they should be gathering wood and then crafting that wood into arrows and then providing those arrows to the archers, something like that. And this can then form the foundation for building out your colony in more complex ways in the future. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with my progress, so be sure to stay tuned until then. And remember, you can join the Discord server to get daily news. I post everything I do as I create it, and it'll also let you get more involved in the development process. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.